All right, we are just about ready to begin. Oops. All right. The talk this evening is going to be very short. And the reason for that is we are working through a method of coming to events. And this talk is part of a very long talk, and I had to find a breaking point that didn't leave things hanging between the two parts. In fact, there may even be three parts. I'm still working on the notes. So tonight we're going to do the first of three parts on understanding how to come to predict events or to understand events when they have occurred. Now, tonight will be quite a bit of review. I'm very big on review because when you go over things from different points of view, again and again, you get a dimensionality or a depth that you don't otherwise get. And so there will be a lot of review. All right, let's start digging in. Let's work our way toward the subject by saying that this is a series of talks on astrodynamics. And astrodynamics is a study of change in the psycho-spiritual atmosphere that is due to astrological or astrological changes. Of course, we're doing this relative to people. We can talk about it at large, but we're doing it relative to people because we can help people. At one time, very early in my career in practicing astrology, I did a lot of predicting macrocosmic things like earthquakes and things of that nature. And then it came to me one day that I was spending an awful lot of time predicting things that I couldn't do anything about. And that's when I switched more toward using astrology to help myself and other people. So we're looking at applied astrology in macrocosm and microcosm. The microcosm, of course, is the individual. It's the individual horoscope that we're working with. Now, the macrocosm is the universe. It's the whole world. There are intermediary states between the macrocosm and microcosm, such as a country or a society or a religion. And we may look at eventually at the astrodynamics of countries. I'm thinking of perhaps looking at the United States chart and looking at various periods in history and various events in history and looking at them in terms of astrodynamics. We may get to that. At my age, nothing is promised as far as great futurity. Now, the macrocosmic horoscope is what's happening in the skies. The microcosmic horoscope is the natal horoscope. And what we're doing is studying dynamic changes relative to the natal horoscope. If you look at the macrocosm, all of the changes that are happening in the heavens are an ongoing process. In a way, it is never duplicated. It's always changed. It's always different. That's different than a horoscope. A horoscope is one moment in time, and it is that moment relative to every other moment, which is changes or relationships between other moments in time. That is what we're studying with AstroDynamics. However, if the ongoing cosmos is, you might say, the horoscope of God, the difference is that it never changes, and it's always different. Now that brings up theological problems, which I would love to go into, but I doubt that we will at this time, because some people have a view of divinity as being eternal and unchanging. But in the actual working out of it in the cosmos, and when you take into account evolution, like stellar evolution or evolution of species and things like that, everything is changed. So there's a paradox between the eternity of divinity and the mutability or change of divinity. Now, it would be lovely to go into that. We're not actually going to do that because we don't. Are we? Okay, I have to check the dials every now and then, because this is not a theological course, and it would be a very difficult, long time to talk about something that is that deep and that profound. Paradoxes are always difficult to deal with. There may not ever be a final answer to them, or that final answer might be very different than what we expect. All right. Let's use to understand the relationship to macrocosm and microcosm without looking at it as ongoing astronomical changes relative to a horoscope. Let's use the human physical body as an example to get at what we're trying to understand. Now, in the body, each cell metabolizes. It has its own life. However, even though it has its own life, it doesn't have its own life unless the macrocosmic organism is alive. It's like there is this overlife that allows the little life within it to exist, which we can see is very much like the macrocosm and the microcosm. Now, the macrocosm has control over the function of the microcosm. For example, if we look at a muscle cell metabolizes, but if the spirit working through the brain says, I want to run, the macrocosm then has all of the cells in the muscles, especially those involved with breathing and running and, leg muscles and things like that. The metabolism goes at a higher rate. So the over-consciousness controls the function of the microcosm. Now, but each cell, each microcosm also affects the macrocosm. Now, if a cell is ill or a collection of cells are ill, the macrocosm can't function perfectly. When we're ill, we realize we can't even think straight because we're in some kind of malaise of consciousness that we're not thinking straight is the words that we use. Now, this example of using the human physical body as a macrocosm and a microcosm, it's not perfect in several ways, especially that one of those ways is that the microcosm cannot completely derail the macrocosm. We can cause the universe a lot of trouble especially if we are magicians or something like that, but we can't, we're not anywhere near being able to derail the macrocosm. But in our bodies, very few cells can threaten the entire life of the whole. So we can screw up nature, but we can't kill God or even vaguely impair divinity. We're talking about things of an order and a nature that are very different than the example. All right. Now, let's turn a little bit to astrodynamics in the macrocosm, which would be called the quality of the times. Oh. As we've noted about the times, there are two different kinds of astrological influences operative in the psychospiritual astrological atmosphere. We have called them the astronomical and the cyclical influences, which is not a perfect dualism or designation. We could have called them the natural and the cosmogonical, which would be more accurate, but if we did that, we would be, we'd have to have, everybody would have to know what we meant by those words. We're going to come back to the cosmogonical or the cyclical again, but for now, let's just say they are different, but they share one thing in common. And the one thing that they share in common are qualities. There are qualities to what comes from the astrological influences of the planets, and there are qualities that come through the periods of time that, time is flavored. Now, the qualities have planetary names. The qualities have planetary names, but they aren't necessarily from the planets. Now, for example, we can say there's a quality of something being quick and something mental and something emotionally neutral. We call that quality being mercurial. Now, the quality mercurial can be associated with the planet Mercury. In fact, most people would believe that it comes from the planet Mercury. However, the mercurial quality existed before there was a planet Mercury, and it will exist long after there is a planet Mercury. You might even say that Mercury is a consolidation or a precipitation from the quality Mercury. In the cosmogonical or the cyclical view of astrology, periods of time have names that are associated with planets, but those names are really the names of qualities. So the planetary names of the planets, of the periods of time or the segments of time are called like the days of the week: Saturn, Sun, Moon, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus. Now there are subtimes and sub-subtimes and things like that. We're going to come back to that again. But this is just enough to say that there are two influences in the atmosphere at the same time. One is working naturally through the planets, and that is what most of standard astrology is involved with. The other has to do with the whole creative process itself and how in that creative process periods of time and sub-periods of time have flavors, and in those periods and sub-periods things are accomplished according to the flavor that is concentrated at a given time. Now, some people might object to saying that there are two astrological fields of activity present at the same time. That's not hard to accept. If we think about it, at this very moment, all the radio stations that can be picked up by a radio, they're in the air all the time, and they're not interfering with each other. If we want, we can tune our radio to one or tune it to another. And the same thing is true, except that one is more creative and one is more carrying out the destinies of things. All right. We're gradually working our way. Again, I'll just mention, this is a long double or triple talk in order to get at events. All right. We're looking at timing in general and working our way toward timing in specific. And when we speak about specific timing, we talk about events. And in the next talk, we're going to say an awful lot about events, not just that they happen. You know, there's a sort of a thing with astrologers, they get a mania that they want to be able to predict events. And they feel there's some kind of power in being able to predict events, even if you can't do anything about them, when it isn't the prediction that is important about an event, it is the meaning that comes out of it. And certainly in these talks, we're going to, even though we're working toward the predicting of events, ultimately we're trying to get to is the meaning of events when they take place and the likelihood of getting a full understanding of that meaning out of it. That's the value of an astrologer. And if an astrologer is working with somebody and there are events in that individual's life, you want to get the most out of them. And you want to get it out of them as soon as possible. You don't want to wait until another rebirth in order to get the understanding of them. You don't want to wait until some existence after death in order to understand what life meant. That's the way it is for most people. They don't understand what life means until after it's over. But of course, I didn't understand a lot of people in my life until they were no longer there. That's one of the funny things in life. It's wonderful to be in touch with the moment and in the moment so that you understand the meaning of what's happening as it's happening and not with some delayed triggering. Again, I'm very far from the notes here. I'm taking that kind of a talk tonight since it's a short talk, and I'm afraid it might end up not being a short talk if I do too many of these side trips. All right, we're using what we're very lightly calling a funnel method. That is, we are beginning with the broad scope of things and then narrowing down to a moment, and the moment of an event. And we've gotten so far to say that we are dealing with two different types of astrology, the cyclical cosmogonical astrology and the astronomical, astrological, or the standard astrology. All right, we've gotten that far. Now, let's begin with the microcosmic astrological astrology. When we say that, we mean the horoscope. Let's try to determine likely times for events from what we know. And that disclaimer, from what we know, is important. Because even with astrology, we know very little about futurity. Without astrology, some people have social savvy that they can see things, that couple is headed for a breakup, Or we can say, oh, that child is headed for destiny, a very high destiny. But there people have that knowledge without astrology. Astrology certainly helps, but from what we know from astrology, it's not so much. Knowledge, astrological knowledge, has not really evolved very far. We have a lot of people with a lot of data, but the pondering of what it all means and how to get at what it all means, astrology has not gotten very far. That's because human progress has moved in other directions. We're conquering the material world. We have a lot of technical abilities to do all sorts of things. And that's where our emphasis has been. It has not been so much on looking at what the optimal conditions are for human development. And even if those things are found, people have so many prejudices and biases that they don't take them, they don't take wisdom into account. But I don't want to become a railing old man saying, oh, our world is going to hell in a handbag. But that sort of thing. All right. The subject of how to bring astrology and spiritual things more into focus and in greater importance in society is a very big question. And I would like to go into that, but that's beyond the reach of what we can do in these talks. We'd never get anything done. It's as it is, it's very slow in getting things accomplished. Okay, we're going to try to do something anyway to talk about periods and times and narrow down to events. Now, let's do a little bit of review of what we have done so far with the funnel. First, we looked at segments of life. But the segments of life are at the lip of the funnel. The segments of life do not present or do not precipitate changes in attitude, and they do not precipitate events, which is what we're trying to get to. What we're saying is that astrological attitudes or fields of opportunity or events or people that are going to be involved in events take place in sectors of a human life that do not directly affect astrologically the things that take place. I don't know how to say it. We talked about the broadest sectors of life. We're saying that astrological things happen within these sectors, even though these sectors are not themselves activators and they are not necessarily astrological. We're saying that we've divided life into different segments. The first half of life and the second half of life and things of that nature. And we're saying that astrological things that happen in the different sectors have different meanings because they happen in those sectors, because they happen during a process that's going on. The sectors of life indicate a process which is the unfoldment of a human life and things as they develop in a human life. For example, if we have a transit in a horoscope, in an infant, it would have a very different meaning for that infant than it would for somebody who was an old-aged person. So, some significant transits have, or all transits have different meanings at different ages. Now, some transits happen repeatedly, but they mean something different each time they happen. Astrologers talk about this, and most astrologers talk about a Saturn return, which happens 29 and some months, years. And they talk about things, what happens at your Saturn return. I think that's a mistake. If they talked about the Saturn return to a conjunction of the Sun, that might be more important. But Saturn to Saturn is not very productive of understanding. Okay, so some cycles happen within all of the sectors of life, and then you can understand the sectors of life and the cycles as well. And we're going to do a little bit of that. Not a whole lot, but a little bit. The first sectors we looked at were halves of life. And we say the first half of life and the second half of life. And astrologically, the halves of life are divided by the Uranus coming opposite its natal position. Uranus comes opposite its natal position at about age 43. And we call that planet, Uranus is a planet of often frantic activity. And so the Uranus coming opposite its natal position is sometimes referred to as midlife crisis. After the crisis, one looks at life very differently. One looks at life very differently because the process of life has changed, but not the astrological influences. So the sectors, this is something that will be repeated again and again, the sectors of life do not produce events, but they do help to understand and interpret events when they happen. There are most astrologers don't even study these things, which I think is kind of foolish. But that's why I'm not really an astrologer. I want to understand life, and astrology is a big help, but I'm not really what you would call an astrologer, and quite a few astrologers would sort of look down at me. There are no standard rulerships for the first and second halves of life. I usually use the moon and the sun. The moon for the first half and the sun for the second half. The moon can mean many things, so that needs some clarification. But basically, the moon, from the very conception when the sperm meets the eggs, the moon is a builder. It is a formulator. The sun is a producer of life, but the life works on and disintegrates the form. So if you have too much moon in an environment, things grow to such an extent that they choke out each other with life. On the other hand, if you have too much sun, you have a desert. And so the first and second halves of lives have lunar and solar qualities. The first half being building, the second half being disintegrating, but disintegrating to process and get something out of it. Now, you can be absorbed with excessive growth, and you can be absorbed with excessive disintegration of things. It's all right. That's as far as we're going to go with that. That's enough of a review and enough of a re-looking at the information. If you look back at the talks previous to this, when we first covered this, you'll see that we said different things than what we say now. Not that there are contradictory different things, but hopefully they are more complementary, and you get to understand things more by looking over them at different things. Very few people have no goals in the first half of life. Everybody has goals that they're seeking, and very few people institute completely new things in the second half of life. Only rare times that we start a whole new enterprise in the second half of life, and those are special events when they do happen, and we'll maybe look at some of those somewhere along the line. So we can say that in the first half of life, we're building and looking forward, and in the second half of life, we're looking backwards. That brings us to the thirds of life. In the thirds of life, we can look at them relative to a normal human life. This is an almost verbatim repeat, but in the first third of life, one is only looking ahead. One wants to go to school, one wants to graduate, one wants to learn to drive, one wants to establish one's own business or one's own career. And that's what the first part of life is like. The second third of life, one looks forward and one looks backward. And events are when children are born. You look back at your children and you see them going through the different stages of development. As you're looking back at them, you think about your own past and how you came to be as you are now. But you still have to support those kids, so you still have career goals, and you want to buy a house so that you can have a home for the children to grow up in. And eventually, when your children have children, by then you're retired. Your career is over, and you're looking back at things, and you're watching your children watch their children. You have that grandparently advantage or vantage of looking back at things with a once removed view, and that gives you a more philosophical understanding. That's a good way to look at the thirds of life from what is started in the halves of life of looking forward and then looking backward. Now, you might describe the halves of life as like going up a hill and then going down. In the second half of life, you could say you're coasting into decadence, but with that decadence, an understanding of how you got to be there, is valuable. And this actually has physical things. You might say, in the first half of life, as you're going on, you put on more weight until you get at the midlife crisis. In the midlife crisis, you have what is called the spare tire. You have an extra layer of fat around your midsection. But as you get older, that disappears. If you look at it carefully, look at all the oldsters that you know that are 70 or 80 or 90 years old, you don't find many fatties in that period. Like that is disintegrated. All right, we can look at how the sectors of life, in this case the first half and the second half, how they change astrological conditions. They don't actually change them, but what the process of what you're going through in maturing changes the meaning of astrological influences. Suppose somebody has the sun progressed square to natal Saturn. Usually that is some kind of block. Your self-development, the sun represents the self in the highest sense and in the ego sense, gets stymied in a square to Saturn. And if that happens in the first half of life, it is like some kind of block comes along and self-doubt comes in, and you don't know whether you can accomplish it or not. And sometimes, for some people, it means a change of course altogether. In the second half of life, when you're looking over what has happened, you can see how some of your egoism retarded or diminished your accomplishments. When you're looking back at what you've done and you come to that Sun square Saturn, and you experience that in yourself, and you can say, oh, I'm now self-aware, and I can see that I was egoistic in this and had to have my own way, and my having to have my own way caused a blockage. Could even, if you don't get your own way, it could even cause an extreme loss of temper. In the second half of life, that doesn't happen so easily. Okay. Again, we have to mention the same thing as is about the third or fourth repetition. The sectors do not cause events, but they indicate the differences in events when they do occur. All right. Now let's look again on the thirds of life. And there are a lot of planetary markers for these, and following them in a horoscope, you can see the difference between them. For example, the progressed moon goes around the entire horoscope in 28 years. So we can say that the difference between the first third and the second third of life occurs at the progressed lunar return. Then there's the one that we mentioned just a little bit ago. Saturn goes around the entire zodiac in 29 plus years. The progressed sun passes on average through a sign in 30 years. The average cusp passes through 30 years through one sign in 30 years. The sign of a zodiac is something like an atom, an atom of the zodiac. Uranus passes through 4 signs in 28 years. Neptune passes through 2 signs in 28 years. So between 28 and 30, there are a lot of changes or a lot of markers of changes. Now, in the same way that Uranus coming opposite to Uranus produced the midlife crisis, each of these markers can delineate a significant event that indicates a transition from the first third of life to the second third of life. Now, what we just said about having children and looking back, beginning to look back when you have children, that is something that's based on events that have happened physically in your life. But that is not, those things don't happen at the thirds of life. Some people have very skewed lives so that the time frame is skewed according to social mores. There are societies in which girls have babies at age 12, which is a very different thing from having babies at age 28. So we're talking about two very different things here. We're talking about a kind of cosmic standard and then a social standard that varies according to society. The moon is the planet of growth and development. We've said that just a few minutes ago, that the whole interuterine period in the mother's womb is ruled by the moon. In fact, there's a whole astrology based on that, which we might eventually get to. Again, if I live long enough, we'll get to being able to make predictions or understand, forecast different periods of life according to what happened to you during the time you were in your mother's womb. It's a fascinating study. I don't know if we'll get to it. There's, at the rate we're going, we might not. That might be a thing that I say to the angel of death when it comes to me. You can't take me yet. I haven't gotten to prenatal astrology. I hope you aren't offended by this, but I'm having a fun time doing these. I used to be so serious about giving talks that one would think that astrology was a matter of gloom and doom. But all right, it takes 28 years for the moon to go around. And it's no surprise that at age 28, your body is at its physical prime. After age 28, reflexes are slower, coordination is poorer. We know that like a child who learns a skill while growing in that first 28 years has a huge advantage over someone trying to learn that same skill after age 28. You're not action of the second cycle of the moon is not the same as the first cycle of the moon, so that we can understand that. The Saturn cycle is a little bit more difficult. The first 29 years of life, as seen from the perspective of the Saturn cycle, means something different. Saturn is the preeminent planet of destiny. Saturn, you might say, is the lord of destiny. People hate Saturn because they don't like what comes back to them from their past. We all have a big backlog from past lives when we were much more imperfect than we are now. We sinned more than we sin now, and so we have this backlog that we have to clear up. And when the recording angels help us design our life, they design it such that we can bring back as much of that past destiny, because we have a lot of soul growth locked in that past destiny. They bring it as much as we can take. And so we hate Saturn because we have to face the fact of our own limitations from our own past. So there is a condition that is called Saturn hunting the moon. And it happens mostly when there are negative aspects between Saturn and the moon in the birth chart. The way it works is the moon unfolds something in the developmental process. And it's probably some kind of physical ability or some psychophysical ability. And then the moon comes along, and then Saturn comes along shortly thereafter, and it throws cold water on it. And then the moon unfolds something else, and then Saturn comes behind it and throws cold water on it. That's an example. There are people who do Rolfing or who do body work that know that we have certain psychological or moral qualities locked in us, that we can't move our bodies freely because of these psychophysical things we have built in from past attitudes. And the first cycle of Saturn relative to the moon is how that past destiny gets built into our bodies. And so that we unfold relative to those limitations, we understand things about our own limited consciousness. And all right, but so that's what the Saturn ruling the first third of life is like. When we look at the sun is all about self-development. And we can relate that to the different periods of life. We said in the past, when we talked about the 7-year periods, we said in the first 7 years that when a child is in the first 7 years, its whole identity is locked in its physical body. If it has an owie, like a cut on the finger or something like that, its whole being is in that owie. And so the first 30 years and the aspects that happen in that first sun coming semi-sextile to its natal position indicate development of the self. When a cusp moves 30 degrees, it indicates a rhythm or a pattern of how things are done. The aspects that happen in the passage of a cusp through 30 degrees indicates we all have patterns of how events take place because of aspects. Some people have clusters of events happening in a very short period of time, maybe 2 or 3 years. Others string them out over the whole 30-year cycle, and that's what comes from that. We've already talked about Uranus going through the signs and the changes that happen with hormones and things like that. So we have an understanding of that. I don't want the review to be too much of a review, which it seems to be already becoming. So the first third of life is for developing the body, or developing the development. The second third of life is for use, and it is for perfection. The development of the first third of the body, first third of the life brings things to their prime, but then you want to use them. And in the second third of life, the markers are for perfecting things, for carrying them out. But the second third of life spans the midlife crisis, so the thirds and the halves can be seen in this way. But at any rate, you're still at your peak, even if there's a certain amount of decadence. Like I like watching a lot of basketball, and you see players who are beyond their peak are still sometimes more effective than players with the same amount of talent who are still coming up to their peak. It's because they have that experience, and with that experience they can still perform at a high level. And in the third third of life is for abstraction. You abstract and you understand with perfection the meaning of what has happened in the thirds. Now, with thirds, we're talking about talents. The talents are built in the first third, they're used in the second thirds, and they're understood in the third third. So this is all about talents. So let's take at least a little example. Venus trine Jupiter. In the first third of life, somebody with Venus trine Jupiter is gushing over with love. They're popular without even trying. We all know those kids in school. They didn't necessarily weren't the brightest. They weren't necessarily the dumbest, but they were just gushing over with something that made the people want to be with them. In the second third of life, those skills are put to use, and they are polished. That is, a person knows how to work through society with ease, and they can calm difficult situations, or they know how to bring cheer when things become too dour, or something like that. In the third third of life, one becomes a social maven, that they don't have to actively practicing and using their social affability, but they can when they need to. And when they do, it is with great efficiency, and there is understanding that comes along. It just doesn't calm people, but people understand why they needed to be calmed and how they were calmed. Again, the sectors of life don't produce any events, but they do provide backgrounds, and those backgrounds allow talents and attitudes and qualities to go through different stages. All right, this brings us to quarters of life. And I don't spend a lot of time with the quarters of life, because what I find is that the smaller the segments of life, with one exception, the harder it is to make differentiations. It's easy to make a differentiation between the first and second half of life, and not quite so easy, but still pretty facile when you divide life into thirds. But when you start dividing it into quarters, you're getting into small segments of life, something that happens every 20 years. It's hard to differentiate. The astrological markers for quarters of life are the conjunctions of Saturn and Jupiter, which happen every 20 years. And for this reason, historians who study life in general call a generation a period of 20 years. And those 20-year periods, which are the quarter of a life, have been studied enormously by historians, or used to be. I don't know what historians are doing these days. I think they put into a computer the prices of eggs in 1 month in 1829 versus 1 month in 1830 or something like that. They get in all kinds of, I don't want to make fun of people's professions, but I think that scholarship has gotten too computerized and too focused on little things, and rather than on the characters of times. There still are greatest historians that do this, but Arnold Toynbee from England used the Saturn-Jupiter cycle and follows it through centuries history. Fascinating way of looking at things by looking at quarters of what turned out to be quarters of people's lives throughout history. All right. I suppose we're over an hour already. My goodness, this is going to be another long one, even though I didn't intend it. That means the next one might be 2 or 3 hours long, because I want to make it all in one haul, but I don't know if I'll be able to. The one exception that we talked to about sectors, smaller sectors, is the 7-year periods, and we've already talked about them. We've talked about the climacterics, and we said that the climacterics are 7-year periods in which significant changes happen in the bodies of humans. Not only the physical bodies, but the etheric bodies, the emotional bodies, the mind, the spirit, the life spirit, and on the different stages of soul. They take place over 7-year periods. And those 7-year periods have 2 clear demarkers. One of them is the moon, and the moon is, it goes square to its natal position every 7 years by progression. And with those, and we know that the square is the aspect of building. A wall will not stand if it's not on a square. In fact, even the stuff of matter is built on the right-hand rule. So I put the left hand out. I have an injury in my right hand. But fields form at right angles around a vector of energy. So the stuff itself of matter is based on the square. The other ruler is Uranus, and Uranus passes through one sign or one sign or 30-degree sector every 7 years. And we're saying that Uranus rules the endocrines, which is just how things are brought into the physical body. So you might say that the Uranus rules the hormones, and hormones rule. I'm trying to cut this short because it's way too long. So we're saying that in these 7-year periods, there are changes that are of the deepest type, and that they go deeper and deeper into our inner spiritual beings. And we looked into that in a previous talk, looking at the 7-year periods and breaking down periods within the 7-year periods, and that's enough. We may return to this at a future time. All right, that's what we began with. We began with the sectors. The sectors themselves do not precipitate events, but they change how the other astrological things will be effective. An aspect or a transit of some kind of period or another, if it happens in this different sectors of life, it has different meanings. All right, that takes us off the lip of the funnel, and now let's go further down into the funnel. We're trying to get to events. And let's begin with the way we looked at events early in this chart. We did that by looking at primary directions. My friend Rick came in and gave us a talk about how one comes to events through primary directions. However, he took a big subject and put it into 1 hour, and it was like an avalanche of information coming at us, and it was not a short systemic value. You do this, and you do this, and you do this. All right. We're looking at events through primary directions, and we're sort of jumping from the lip of the funnel to the nozzle in one jump. And that's because the astrology of primary directions is like that. The astrology of directions is primarily for coming to events. It isn't so well suited to different sectors. But basically, primary directions are the relationships of cusps of houses in dynamics in relation to planets and points in the horoscope. And since the cusps of houses are based on the rotation, axial rotation of the Earth, it's very Earth-oriented. It's a much different method than the secondary progressions, which we're going to spend an enormous amount of time with the next time we meet. So, as the cusps move and they interact with planets, they produce events, because the planets are the markers of events. Now, primarily, the midheaven, the 10th house cusp, and the ascendant are used for primary directions because they're actually the only cusps that we really know. The other intermediary cusps are inferred, and they are inferred by various different geometrical systems. And every few centuries somebody comes up with a new system for determining where the cusps are. So if you look for something like, if you're looking between the 10th house and the ascendant, the cusp of the 11th house, if you use a Regiomontana system or a Placidian system or a Koch system, you get a different place for where that cusp will be, which when you're dealing with trying to get things right down to the day, it's very difficult to make accurate predictions if you don't know where the cusp began in the first place and you don't know how fast that cusp is going to be changing. So you can see that there were basically all kinds of wars about this. Now the strange thing is that primary directions are the oldest form of prediction. One doesn't know the age of transits. One expects that there were transits long ago, but in predictive methods, primary directions are very old. But in the ancient times, most astrologers did not have systems for determining house cusps. So they basically made equal houses and they did their directing from that if they used other ones anyway. All right, what we're trying to say then is that as the ascendant in midheaven or the descendant and the low point, the 4th house cusp, as they move, they produce events. Now, this is not to say that astrologers use house cusps alone when they use primary directions. They use transits. You know, there are purists, I imagine, that try to do everything with primary directions, but you can't do that. And so other things like transits are brought in to get the flavor, to try to understand what comes out of a direction. You know, for example, if the 10th house cusp, the midheaven, moves over a planet in the 10th house, that might indicate fame. But if the ascendant moves over a planet that rules the 10th house, that also might indicate fame. And so having different kinds of information that comes from transits, you can get a feeling of what that planet in the first house is going to mean. If it's going to mean something about changes in the physical personality, or is it going to mean something about fame for that individual? And so the more information that you can get in, the better it is. All right. This has taken too long for the material, but there's one thing I do want to go into more, and that is when you have primary directions, you still want to know what phases of time are like. But so in order to, you can do that, or the attempt has been done to understand subsectors within sectors in order to get the flavor of what we're calling the times. Some of that is done by transits, but using primary directions, different things have been used by different astrologers. Now, to do that, we're going to work with something that we don't work with often. All right. I'm not showing the entire mandala. This is the standard mandala, and it has the signs, the houses, the planets are the little balls moving through it. But this needs interpretation, and we're bringing it to interpretation because we're trying to get to something that practitioners of primary directions from ancient times have used. Let's focus specifically on one sign, and I'll try to interpret everything in it. Let's take Virgo. Virgo has the color purple, which is designated as the color of Mercury. Now, Virgo is unusual because if you look at each of the signs, oh, I can't see it. They're here, all right. There are 4 bands in the center part, and the outer band is the ruler. The next one in is the exaltation. Then the fall, and then the detriment. So, Mercury, Virgo is ruled by Mercury. Its exaltation is there. Its fall is, Venus has a fall there, and Neptune and Jupiter are in detriment in Virgo. All right. Now let's get at the big chart itself. The outside is ruled by Mercury. That's the ruler. The next part, the next layer in, are decanates. And decanates are 10-degree sectors of within each sign. Now, there are different ways that our decanates are used for interpretation, because astrologers have gone through all sorts of things. Modern astrologers use decanates in a way that I think is totally improper and is not helpful at all. But these are Chaldean decanates, which cannot be actually put on a board like this because the Chaldean decanates change, and they keep changing through a 7-year period, so we can't do that. What we're trying to get to, the whole of this was to get to these little sectors here. This one here, there's 3. There are 5 little tiny sectors which is within each sign, but they're not all the same length. If you look at them carefully, you can see that these sectors are called terms, T-E-R-M-S, and the terms that are ruled by Mercury are smaller than the terms that are larger than the terms that are ruled by Jupiter. And terms are supposed to be sub-sectors giving specific qualities. And so that if a cusp is moving through a term, it gives you a little bit more background of feeling. I don't know of any astrologer, modern astrologer, that uses terms anymore. Even the astrologers that use primary directions, who are the ones that developed the ideas of terms in the first place. But so there would be a mercurial quality, which would be a magnification of the mercurial quality of Virgo, but it would be a magnification during the terms of Mercury. There would be some kind of a conflict during the terms of Jupiter, because Jupiter and Mercury are, Jupiter is in its detriment, it's in its weakness there. Now, the terms are not based on any particular spiritual philosophy or astrological philosophy or cosmology or anything like that. The terms are based on observations. Now, that's a wonderful thing. Astrology is very important. Observation is very important to astrology, but different people observe things differently. So in the ancient times, when terms were practiced, different people used different terms. The terms that I have on the board here are the terms from Claudius Ptolemy. Claudius Ptolemy resolved all of the ancient world and wrote two books. One was called the Almagest, which was the study of the fixed stars, and the other one was called the Tetrabiblios. And in the Tetrabiblios, he takes all of the ancient astrology and puts it down in a formulated manner, so that astrology, almost all astrology since then, can be traced back to Claudius Ptolemy, not directly, but from the Arabic astrologers took from Claudius Ptolemy. But at the time, these are the terms according to Claudius Ptolemy. However, there are also terms according to the Chaldeans, that is the Babylonians. And there are terms according to the Egyptians. They don't agree. So if you want to practice terms, you have to try and see which ones are more accurate in that. So again, you're almost back to square one in reinventing the terms. All right, we now see that, let's, oops. I'll get there yet. All right. All right, let's see. So what we have done is we've looked at the lip of the funnel. And the lip of the funnel doesn't change any astrological influences. It just gives the background. It doesn't produce the qualities. It's the background. And we've taken a leap from the lip of the funnel right down to the nozzle in using primary directions to come to specific events. We've looked a little bit of how you come down the funnel very steeply with looking at things like terms and things of that nature. Now what we want to do is the next time we meet, we're going to take a very careful way of going down the lip of the funnel down to the nozzle in the way that any of you in practicing astrology are going to use. It is, it's something that it will be much more practical. It might take 2 more talks to get through this because there's a lot of information and there are a lot of attitudes. When it comes to predicting events, there are a lot of attitudes that have to be held in order for it to not just be a big ego trip or a demonstration of power or something of that nature. Thank you very much. I had a good time, probably too much of a good time. I think you got the information. A lot of it was a review, but it was review from a different point of view. And I probably could review it all again, and when I did so, other things would come out of it. This is why I like that spiral method of education. You go over things again and again, you get something more out of them, you go deeper, and you come to conclusions along the way, but always better. Thank you very much. We will meet again next month, and in the third Thursday of the month is the philosophy talk, spiritual philosophy. I hope to see you then. Thank you.